Hi, I'm Kate Livy, the Director of Education and the Associate Curator here at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, and I'd like to welcome you back to another feature of Chesapeake Treasure here on Facebook, an opportunity for us to explore one of the 68,000 objects in our collection. So some of you probably know already I'm a bit of an oyster nut. And I have an oyster shell here that I keep in my office that I put some of my safety pins in and things like that, paper clips. And this is a really big one. So for those of you that don't know, a legal size oyster, to harvest an oyster in the Chesapeake Bay, it has to be at least 3 inches in size. This one's pretty big. This is probably closer to 5 inches. But in our collections, something you never get to see if you come to the Maritime Museum is the mother of all oyster shells. You might have heard about it in whispers or in rumors, and I've got it for you today. Prepare yourself. Okay, so pretty big oyster shell, right? Pretty big. Dun, dun, dun. It is the largest, the hugest oyster I have ever seen in my entire life. And this particular species is probably the same species as this oyster. This is a Crassostrea virginica, the eastern oyster, native to the east coast of the United States, all the way up to Nova Scotia and down and around to the Gulf of Mexico. This particular fossil was found along the Rio Grande. And so you might think, oh, why do we have this Texas oyster here in the Chesapeake Bay? Well, this is the same species, and this is a good example of how large oysters, if left to their own, can possibly grow over time. The oyster that I have here is probably about 4 or 5 years old. An oyster grows about approximately an inch a year. This particular monster might be 30 years old. And while that's older than most oysters might live, it's possible. So today in the Chesapeake, we really, oysters usually get to 3.5 inches, and we harvest them. And there are some pockets of larger oysters, but this monster is a great example of what people might have seen when they first visited the Chesapeake. The first European visited the Chesapeake in the early part of the colonial period. So there are these incredible descriptions of oysters. They talk about oyster reefs sticking up out of the water. They developed over thousands of years from these, shoreline bottom dwellers into these underwater castles that are rising up out of the water at low tide. And these oysters, they describe being so large that they have to be cut into 3 pieces to fit them into their mouths. There's a Swiss traveler, Franz Louis Michel, who comes and he visits, and he also talks about not just eating one of these monsters, but he also talks about how his ship actually wrecked on an oyster bar, and they had to wait until high tide to come and lift them off the reef so that they could leave and go about their way. And this is the type of oyster that they're talking about. Now, I love this because it reflects this incredible, primordial, abundant Chesapeake landscape that just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, we have so heavily harvested oysters that you never would see something like this in the wild today, but it's a reminder that before we started harvesting the Chesapeake's oysters at the rate that we do today, that they would have been in these huge shoals and filtering the bay's water. So one of the things to consider is that a large scale oyster, a large, adult oyster can filter, and you might have heard this, up to 50 gallons of water a day. Now, a lot of people think, oh no, there's no way they could totally do that. Yes, they can. Here at the Maritime Museum, for some of our festivals, we'll actually fill up a tank of bay water, murky a little bit, and we'll put some oysters in, and by the end of the day, it's like somebody just Windexed it clean. And an oyster like this, I mean, if this oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day, imagine the amount of volume of water that this oyster could filter. And when I say filter, it's not like a Brita filter. The idea with oyster filtration is that oysters are filter feeders. That means that they want to eat algae. Algae is just sort of suspended in the water. It's really the bottom of the food chain. And oysters, obviously, they can't move. So they're kind of stuck with where they are, and if there's a lot of current moving towards them, they're going to slowly pull the water through their bill. They're going to move it around on the inside of their shell. They're going to move it towards the sort of lips and tongue that an oyster has. inside its shell. The oyster will then spit out any sediment that they don't digest that, and then they eat the algae, and then they release this stream of clean water. So just think about them as kind of like nature's vacuum cleaners. You know, stuff goes in and it doesn't necessarily come out. So that's why when we also talk about historical accounts of the bay, one of the reasons why the bay is so clear, because we had these natural filter feeders that existed. And it's easy for us looking at the modern Chesapeake to forget that the bay used to be clear. We had 2 summers ago, we had incredibly clear water, not because of oysters, but because we had a dry spring and a lot less sediment running into the bay. But when I look at this fossil oyster, to me, it just tells this story of a bay where huge millions and millions and millions of oysters of this size were filtering the water in the Chesapeake, allowing you to see down 20 feet or more to, you know, through these swimming schools of shad and rockfish, a bay where an organism this enormous could be supported by the algae that was floating around in the water. So this is just one of the cooler things, I think, that we have here at the Maritime Museum. And again, it's a cool part of our environmental story, dating back, you know, thousands of years from before the Maritime Museum was ever here. So I hope you've enjoyed checking out, I mean, just this huge oyster shell. And I'd invite you to come check out our Oystering on the Chesapeake exhibition here at the Maritime Museum if you've enjoyed learning a little bit about the Chesapeake environment and the way that oysters are a big part of that. Thank you for joining us again today for Chesapeake Treasure. I hope you had fun looking at one of our very cool objects, and that I look forward to talking to you next week about something else equally as cool. So have a great afternoon and enjoy your weekend.